We continue to share with you what it means to be an international educator. We speak to the dispositions and character strengths many folks engage to be excellent educators and remarkable human beings. Our guest for this episode, Mona Stuart, exemplifies such character while demonstrating how flexibility and a growth mindset have led her to take on various leadership roles in different schools and communities. Check out our show notes to learn more about Mona's long and varied international career. We started the conversation with Mona sharing a going global story involving romance, a new theme in our ever-expanding list of international teaching experiences. Mona then spoke about the many roles she has filled throughout her career. Because Mona is so multifaceted, we digressed from our usual format to have her respond to 4 guiding questions for this episode. Mona covered the topics of boarding schools, transitions, admissions, and pivoting out of a career as an international educator. Get ready for an informative and fascinating show as Mona further paints the picture of international schooling. This episode was recorded on August 29th, 2023. We now give you the delightful Mona Stuart.
Well, hey there, Mona. Welcome to Educators Going Global. It's so great to see you.
It's good to see you too. Thank you for having me.
Thank you for being here today. So, how about if you start, please, by telling us where in the world you are at the moment?
I am in Washington State at our lake house just south of Bellingham.
Sounds wonderful. So, what we usually like to start with is a going global story, which is designed to give people a taste of the overseas life. Do you have one for us?
Sure. Well, I ended up going overseas as a single teacher, and so did my now husband. And so I was teaching in Germany at a boarding school, and Tim was teaching in Turkey. And once we fell hard for each other, Tim ended up realizing that he wanted to be closer. So he drew a literal circle at that time on a map that was like 3 hours in any direction from me and started looking at international schools within that radius. And so he went to the London Job Fair. He had been on the circuit, and then he got the call back that he was shortlisted for this boarding school in Switzerland. But when the headmaster called him, he said, because it's a boarding school, I'd really also, you said that you had a serious relationship. I'd also like to interview your fiance. And Tim and I were not engaged at the time. So he had the awkward call to make back to me.
Oh, no.
And said, hey, in his version, he says, so, hey, remember me? And I ended up having to hop on a train. It told me something about where my heart was with him, that I hopped on a train, went to Switzerland, interviewed, and, he ended up thankfully getting the job. And we ended up having all 3 of our children in Switzerland in that place and working there for 5.5 years.
That's awesome. And was that Grant Fiedler?
It was Grant Fiedler. Yeah.
Lovely, lovely man.
Yeah.
Oh, that's a great story. I love it.
So we're going to need to add romance as one of our categories going forward. What do you say, Audrey?
Yeah, I know a lot of people who met and married overseas for sure. That's awesome.
Well, I think it was one of the staying features in our lives, though, is that we made that choice before we met, and that was a commitment that we each had, which was really powerful.
That is
Definitely.
Beautiful.
All right, Mona. To say that you wear many hats is not really covering the full depth of all the different roles that you've covered. And I think the 4 that we're going to cover just kind of get things started in all the things that you've done. So we're going to break from our usual format of just having one guiding question, and you're going to have 4. So you're going to be our first person to take on 4 guiding questions, very topical, that get into boarding schools, transitions, admissions, and then the pivoting that you and Tim have done from international school work, returning to your home country. So let's start with boarding school life with the question of, hey, what is working and living at a boarding school like? And once you share about that, what are some trends in this area of international schooling?
Yeah, boarding school life, there's no other way to describe it than immersive. It is just a complete immersion experience into the realities, I think, of a student's holistic life. And so, because you're literally in many, many cases in class with students, living in a dorm situation with them, potentially, dealing with your laundry along with their laundry, going to the cafeteria and eating meals with the students that you teach, being there to witness what happens on weekends and having some accountability over student weekends, being in a study hall setting each evening or when you're on duty and starting to see the impacts, like the roll on impacts of the work that is given during the day in the course of a student's life, the relational aspects, of seeing students that are working through roommate situations and how they relate to parents and all of those different situations. I think one of the key things that can be hidden is all the reasons why students do go to boarding school in the first place. So it gives you some real insight into, I would say, some of those motivations, which can be safety in some cases, that students are being sent because there's some perceived dangers in their current lives, stability, where they are coming from families that may be moving more than they would like to or more than they have any control over. And they're just looking for some place where their child can end up having a consistent experience. There are some cases where students are, and there's so many boarding schools, where students are choosing to go there because of their own aspirations academically, whether that's college prep or whether that's, boarding schools that are set up now for elite athletes or there's very niche sort of schools that cater to kids' great strengths. And then there's those that, students go away for a year when their parents are going through tremendous, intense, divorce scenarios or other situations in their lives where they feel like the best place for a child is somewhere else. So you basically are put into that world 24/7 to be a part of those students' lives. And I bring up all those scenarios because I would say boarding is student centered. And so figuring out the boundaries between your life and your teaching, and you may have a faculty family, you may be going on trips around the continent with those kids. It is nonstop. And I would say in the end, it has the potential to be the most meaningful and the most indelible experience possible. And I would say that's also why, when you look at the history of boarding, that can be a very, very positive, meaningful, and indelible experience, or it can also be a very painful, meaningful, and indelible experience. And that's why it makes it such a huge responsibility, I think, to go into boarding.
So, Mona, you're still very much connected to the world of boarding schools.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm wondering, what are some recent changes, whether due to the pandemic?
Mm-hmm.
And also, what do you see on the horizon for boarding schools?
Yeah, I'm currently on the board and have been the board chair of a boarding school in Europe. And so we've been helping and witnessing what it's like to lead through the pandemic. I think the isolation of students has been, obviously a big issue. And just being in that closed environment and then having to manage all those decisions away from parents has been really challenging. I think some of the trends around boarding are definitely in the area of professionalizing boarding staff. I think back in the day, there was a time where you were just considered in loco parentis. You were the parents that were there, and there was no real guidance. There wasn't really an understanding about child safeguarding to the same degree. And I would say since 2017 and some of the issues that have come up around child safeguarding and the vulnerabilities there, that's been one of the biggest pushes. And to create like a separate professionalized staff that's working closest with students. I think there's also changes in just globalization, that boarding school is expanding in its breadth of nationalities, but also in its commitment to serving all students with all kinds of different neurodiverse and learning issues, and not seeing itself as such an elite bastion of, certain types of learners or families that would come to them.
Wow, Mona, that's so much that I wasn't actually aware of. I knew some of it. I've spoken to you before about what it's like to be essentially the parent of all the boarding school kids. Having stayed there for 5 years, I'm imagining that you must really have enjoyed the experience, but it does sound like one that, though it's special, is not to be entered into lightly. So, thank you. Thank you for summing that up. That was very interesting. Was there anything else you wanted to say about that?
Yeah, our time at the beginning of our career, being in a boarding school, gave us for the rest of our lives that insight into what the real life of students can look like. And I just think
Right.
it's such an opportunity for, especially if you are at a place in your life or your career where you are ready to move into that space where students really are and really want to understand every dimension that's impacted by school. It will stay with you for the rest of your life. And for us, those are the relationships with students that still call us, mom and dad, and share with us so many things.
Yeah,
It really is the cohort, both in terms of colleagues and students, that has stuck with us.
that's amazing. You know, that's one thing that David and I have noticed is that when you teach at an international school, you really do tend to have a deeper relationship already with kids. And you're talking about the full spectrum,
Mhm.
what those relationships can become. And that's incredible. It's wonderful to hear. And thank you so much for sharing those insights.
You're welcome.
So, shifting topics, we have a related guiding question. So, you have done a lot with transition and with the pastoral care side of things.
Mm.
What would you say international educators need to consider regarding all the transitions that come with going global, as we
Mm.
call it?
Yeah, I mean, transition in many ways is sort of a skill and an experience that ends up being subliminal in some ways. Like in some ways, we do it and we don't really reflect on it and understand that it's something that over the course of our lives we can get better at, and that there's different principles behind it that really help us. I think one thing that, and especially as people consider leaving, that's really helpful is that a clear goodbye is really important, to have a clear hello.
Mhm.
And that being able to really close off a chapter
Mhm.
in some ways as you leave is so critical to being able to arrive at the right time when you land somewhere. And I think for students as well, you see the learning loss for them at times where they haven't closed things out, and then they're grieving in significant ways when other people are attaching,
Mhm.
when everything's starting. So I think that's one key thing, is just to take the moment, for gratitude where you are, but also to close things off. Like someone said, take the memories and leave the baggage,
Oh, that's beautiful.
from each place where you are, because those things will tend to crop up. I think understanding that you can also be in more places than one. You can belong to more than one place, that it's
Uh-huh.
not just a choice between one place or another, or a family and living abroad, or now and next, or abandoning the last colleagues for the new cohort. But it can be a bit of a dance where you embrace both. And along with the saying goodbye piece, I think it's helpful to realize it's just a great adventure, and the mindset of anticipation can really help to have a beginner's mindset where you just try things on and wear
Mm-hmm.
them around for a while and see how they fit on you because you haven't worn them before. And rather than feeling like things have to fit right away, we can adapt. And I guess one other piece, just thinking about the toll that transition can take, is to stay really reflective about what transition is doing to you as a person, how it's enriching you, but also the cost. I think I learned later than I wished I had that grief is cumulative.
Mm.
And so these comings and goings may seem really adventurous in the moment, and it's easy to leave without really being reflective. And yet at the end, it will come back where the accumulated grief can arise when we least expect it. And so just to keep those channels really clear.
Wow, I'm so glad to hear that because I was the person on the last day of
Mm-hmm.
school who was bawling, and people would feel uncomfortable about that. But
Mm-hmm.
I was unapologetically letting people know how I felt about them and
Yeah.
how much I was going to miss them. And that was my way of getting closure for myself.
Mm.
And I didn't look pretty in the pictures, but to me, it was worth it to get that closure.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I love that you said that.
Yeah, the other side of that is that there are, in every place where we go, there are arrivers, there are stayers, and there are leavers every year. And your sense of gratitude and emotion in those moments also gave the stayers something, that it mattered, that they were staying but knew that it meant something to you.
Right.
So, could you speak to your work in connection with Doug Oda and his work around the world
Mm.
with his book Safe Passage and his network to help schools teach their students, their staff, their parents about this process that you've just described?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I had the privilege of first meeting Doug Oda at an IRCOS conference in Bangkok. And I went to his pre-conference. And at the time, I was the admissions director at Singapore American School. And I fell into a space where I started to understand the impact of transition on all of us and what we can do about it. Doug Oda is a child psychologist and a leading thinker in the space of international school transition and transition in general. And he also looks at attachment theory and how it's connected to learning, and has just done an extensive study that's about to appear that will make some of those connections, more statistically significant and apparent. But Safe Passage Across Networks is about bringing schools together with the commitment to healthy and positive transition for parents, students, and educators, so that we can get such a network going around the world that you could go from one school that really understands the importance of transition and the power of closing out well, that then allows you to go to another span school, another safe passage school that understands how important and significant it is to welcome students in a way that sets them up for well-being and learning. And that in turn just has such a significant effect on the overall well-being and learning of students. The other thing that SPAN does is it does training on the principles of transitions and how to create transition program teams at schools, which really is the work of everyone in a school environment.
Oh, I love that. I'm hoping that universities also hear about this and take it on. I know
Mhm.
that's a big concern as well,
Mm,
is how well not just obviously TCK type kids,
mm.
but all kids transition into a university type lifestyle.
That's it.
And a lot of them really struggle once they get there. So that's just wonderful work. So wonderful to hear about that. We are actually hoping to have Doug on the show. Doug, are you listening? Please reach out.
He'd be a fabulous guest.
Thank you, Mona.
Well, your mentioning of being a director of admissions kind of takes us to the next hat that we're going to ask you to put on. A lot of our listeners are just looking at international education, or maybe they're going to recruit this season that's coming up. And a good portion of them are from public schools. So
Mhm.
when you say admissions, what is that all about? So would you give them just a kind of an overview of the admissions process and how it works?
Different schools approach admissions in different ways. And I think even though it may not be an obvious thing to look at as you look at schools, the way that your own children, if you're bringing children into the school, are treated and received in the admissions process will give you a really good insight into how that works for other families that are coming into the school. And I would say often the way admissions works tends to be a reflection of how the school works. So you have some schools that are going to be very merit based, and there may be a process where students are evaluated on different levels before coming in. And that can be like sitting for exams type of thing, or just doing different types of tests or assessments to come in. That says one thing about a school. In general, international schools have a vision about who they can serve and wanting to serve them really well, and wanting to build an optimal learning community based on their vision and based on those admissions requirements that they have. And so an admissions office will receive applications. Often we'll have parents fly in from around the world to actually look at the school and see what it's like, or bring their children there. And then they're trying to make a best fit match between families and the school itself. And so that process can feel unnerving at first if you're feeling like, well, school should take in everyone that shows up. But I think in the end that also just allows the parents and the admissions office to slow down and to have really honest conversations about the needs of students, the strengths of students, and then to put them in an optimal learning zone with the organized support that they may need. There are so many different specialists often, and people of a very high caliber working with students. And so being able to match those services up with students in advance really contributes to the healthy, positive transition that students can make.
And that takes us back to our early days in Saudi Arabia. I remember one of our administrators saying, here's what we can do for families, here's what we
Mhm.
can't do. Here is who we can serve. And sadly, we can't serve everyone. So we have a mission, and here's who we can have go through the admission process
Mhm.
and bring in and serve to meet their needs. So that thinking really, I think, goes through lots of international schools, especially upper tiered schools that are very on point about who they can serve. But we also know that more and more schools are trying to expand who they can serve as well.
And I think that's a critical point. I think there was a time in international schooling where the expat was seen as someone that almost needed to be vetted to the point where they could breathe sort of rarefied air, and it was about your health, that you didn't want to get sick over there in the big scary world, and there were so many things. And now we've gotten to a point where it's almost in some cases like families are not considered, as they get ready to launch. But I think our capacity to serve is broader than we have imagined.
Yeah,
And so I think the idea that inclusion and serving a whole range of students is something that we can do and that we have to build for is just an increasing and important part of the international school landscape.
absolutely. We had a lovely conversation with Lori Bowl from
Mm-hmm.
Senya about that very topic. And how do you go about training your staff,
Mm-hmm.
and how do you go about expanding your programs so that you can meet the needs of a more diverse learning community?
Mm-hmm.
So that's wonderful. Now, did you have more to say about admissions or?
Yeah, I would just say the way that educators respond to students in their classroom in terms of an admissions decision has so much to do with how a child ends up feeling a sense of belonging and transition in a school community. The questions that come to mind around who admitted this child, or
Mm,
how did this child get into our school, right? Immediately create a whole different setup for a student. So I
mhm.
think being able to know, to trust the admission system and also to work on that together to really know how to welcome students as they arrive is critical.
Mm, that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
It does. So, having talked about some of your experiences over time, having been at boarding school, having been an admissions officer, you are now pivoting into something quite different.
Mm,
Tell us a bit more about your pivot, and maybe if you have any lessons learned about it and
mm.
how to do it well since you know about transitions, and where are you going next?
Yeah, I mean, like I said, it's a lifetime of learning around transition. It always used to challenge me to think that if we do this, if we make transitions our whole lives, why is it that so many people then, when they repatriate or come back to their next life after international education, does it seem to fall apart, right? When we should be good at this point.
Exactly.
And I think it's, there's just so many things to it. And that it goes back to a sense of grief and loss, I think, for a lot of people about, what the lifestyle and the adventures and the identity of international education that we love,
Yeah.
and the shift out of that and trying to find our people. I think for us, it was just really clear. So we've just made the transition from Ethiopia and 30 years in schools around the world back to North America. And one thing I've realized is that, change is quick and decisions can be quick, but transition is slow. It's a process.
Mm,
And so
mhm.
giving ourselves the time to catch up to decisions, to catch up to change is important. And one of the things that Tim and I did is that we just realized it's going to take a year to really figure out even exactly where we should land. And by making that mutual decision that it would take a year, it expanded that whole window of adjustment for us and allowed us, like I said before, to try on new things here and to see what fits for us. It's not where you are in the world, it's also where you are in your life, you know?
Yeah.
And at different stages, there are just different things that work for you or not. We've been blessed in that my husband's new job is still very connected to international schools and to that whole world. And so we have this nice coexistence between our past life with him working with the State Department now in the Office of Overseas Schools. So that's really been a great connection. And, I've just loved the fact that it has given us proximity to our children in different ways and to family. And it's allowed me also to move into a space where I'm thinking about and moving towards coaching and doing that with people who are in transition and also with international school heads and spouses, sort of a hidden people group in the world.
Very cool. That's a nice little niche there that you would certainly fit into beautifully.
Mm.
Well, I have to add, Miss Forgeron, and for Mr. Forgeron, that was some really good advice as you two are transitioning, right? To really give yourself some time. And
Yes.
one of the things that Audrey and I have spoken about that you've brought up, Mona, is attachment and identity.
Mhm.
That we're leaving those identities behind that we've done. We've had attachment to this world, But just as you just said, who am I going to reach out to next? Where am I going to find that community? How am I going to have that cohesion of being a part of a social group? And like you're saying, a part of it is reconnecting with people who've been a part of your life, but now you've got more time to be with them. So that's really, really huge. So thanks for sharing that. And I think maybe in a year or two, we'll definitely get you back on for a lot of reasons, but one, just to see where you and Tim are in your transition to the next stage of your life.
We're curious about that too.
Ah.
We'll see.
But also, I love that you have really committed to the idea that it's going to take a year. I know we talk about that often with people moving to a new school, city, country, environment, culture. Give it at least 6 months to a year for yourself to kind of, there's the honeymoon phase where, wow, this is so cool and amazing and everything's new and exciting. And then there are periods of, oh, what have I done? Oh, no. And then there can be periods of, I'm so happy here. I have such a great community here. And then you might go back through, oh, I miss my friends and family, It is. It takes time. And we need to value the grieving process. And like you said, also value the new attachments that we're making. So that was a really good, helpful insight to hear about. Give yourself the grace. Give yourself the time. Don't have unfair expectations of yourself.
Yeah. And realize in all these transitions that you're really passing the baton. If you see transition as a relay race with yourself, each time that you pass a baton, you're passing it to the next version of yourself. And you're passing it as the person that you've become while you've been in that last leg. And so there's that opportunity not only to sort of reinvent ourselves in a new space, but also to reintroduce ourselves and to understand who we've become. And also to shed, to be comfortable shedding some of those identities that we've had to cling to without being able to realize, yeah, I'm fully human and okay without all of this, without all the stories, right? Without all my going global stories necessarily, or without all the mystique of an overseas life. What does it come down to be fully alive and fully human, no matter where I am in the world?
I love that. That's great. Do you have anything else you'd like to share with us that comes to mind as we go through this variety of topics?
Well, I think the privilege of being in education for me has been being with so many different kinds of students and families and colleagues in so many different kinds of places. And to just realize how rich it all is in every direction. And, whether it's sporting or whether it's someone walking in an office in an admissions setting where families are at the crossroads of their lives. It's amazing how education opens so many other doors that you don't expect to enter.
Yep, absolutely. Fantastic.
It does. And I know our listeners are going to gain a lot from hearing your sharing of the different roles that you have had. And I'm wondering, is there a way for folks to follow you, whether you're on social networking or you have something like that we could share out with them?
Yeah. Well, I'm on Facebook, Instagram, and LinkedIn. And yeah, you'll see they're both a sort of pictorial side of me and a lot of photography and stories from the life that we're living and have lived.
So we'll add those to the show notes, but let's take Instagram. What's your call sign for Instagram?
Yeah. It's Stuart. Yeah. There's also for people that might be going to Africa, I have Addis Alive and Dwell and Ethiopia Alive and Dwell, which is all our experiences in Ethiopia as well. So.
Ah, I love that. That's great. Nestiling.
Tenastaling. That's great.
Well, thank you so much, and a masiganello to
I'm a
you
siganello.
for taking the time to be with us today and to share your gems of wisdom and insights on all these topics. You're an amazing person and a role model for me. It's always so beautiful talking to you. You just have this aura of peace and calm that I just lap up. I let it wash over me whenever I'm listening to you speak. Thank you so much, Mona.
Thank you. Thank you both. I'm a siganello. And yeah, I love what you're doing. I love what you're doing for educators around the world and considering this lifestyle. It's just such a special, special gift.
It definitely is. And as folks will see in our podcast list, we have Tim on as well. So it's great to have the combo of the Stuarts sharing of their experiences. So thank you.
The dynamic duo.
Thank you for joining us today on Educators Going Global.
You can find this podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Podcasts, and all the other usual suspects.
Please subscribe, like us, and leave a review on Apple and Spotify, and let your teaching friends know about us so we can grow our community.
Please reach out at educatorsgoingglobal@gmail.com and join our Facebook group, Educators Going Global, if you have ideas, comments, or wish to share a Going Global story of your own.
You can also find us on Instagram at Educators Going Global.
Please visit our website as well, www.educatorsgoingglobal.com. All our podcast episodes are on there by topic, along with blog posts, Going Global stories, and our ever-growing resource library. For now, this is Audrey
And David.
inviting you to travel,
Teach.
and connect with us.